Thanks for coming in on Friday, the last day of the Viticulture Field Day uh, presentations. Let's get a little bit of uh, stuff taken care of first. MSU is an affirmative action and equal opportunity employer. And as such, we make sure our programs and materials are open to all. This is regardless of race, color, national origin, sex, gender, gender identity, religion, age, height, weight, disability, political beliefs, sexual orientation, marital status, family status, or veteran status. So those of you who have attended previous ones, you probably are very comfortable with Zoom at this point, but if any of you have any issues with Zoom, we have some information here for you. The webinar audio, hopefully you're hearing me. If not, the phone number's right there, but if you have some problems with your audio, you can go to audio settings, work with the sound check. There's some other settings there as well. If you have anything beyond that, definitely call the help desk number right there for technical support. For this webinar, the chat is disabled. We can provide some information via chat, but it's not available to attendees. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask the presenter, go ahead and enter that into the Q&A box, and we will get to it at the end of the presentation. A little bit more here. The sessions have been recorded, and this one will be recorded as well. They are available upon request. There will be a survey that will pop up immediately after the session. If you have attended these sessions before, there's no need to fill it out again. But if you are a new attendee today or you have not filled it out this week, please do so. It helps us out in collecting the information we need to make sure we know what to do with the other presentations going forward this year and in the future. There are no RUP credits for these sessions. There is also a small fruit and hop survey that is currently ongoing. Michigan State Horse Society is helping lead this up. It's a census of basically all the small fruits and hop plantings in Michigan. It helps us understand our research needs and securing grant funding. It helps with making planting decisions and marketing program development. We do not have a link to the survey. At some point, we will put in the name of Ben Smith's email. He is he's part of Michigan State Horse Society. He is the direct contact for making sure you get the survey and help fill it out if you haven't already. This is the final day in the Viticulture Field Days week here. You've hopefully been able to catch some or all of these sessions on various aspects of viticulture, from diseases and horticulture through weeds and insects. Today is the last day. As I mentioned before, Katherine East is the presenter. She's going to be talking to us about grape rootstocks and what they can do for us here in the cool climate of Michigan. She's the viticulture specialist out of the Southwest Research Station. She actually started with us last August. I think she might have to correct me on this, but I think the first time she was in Michigan was for last year's Viticulture Field Day, or one of the first times. So glad to have her here for this one. Actually, with that, I will take it away for Katherine. Actually, there is no field video today. we're just going to go straight into a presentation. So you get to hear from Katherine right away. So take it away, Katherine.
All right, thanks, Mike. Can you guys see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So like Mike said, actually, that was the second time I was in Michigan. The very first time was when I flew out for my interview, and that was in March of last year. So so it's been almost a full year for me, which is pretty exciting. So today's talk is going to be a little different. So the talks previously this week were mostly about subjects that are of imminent concern, so things happening right now. And grape rootstocks are something that we decide at the beginning of a vineyard's life, right, when we put the vines in the ground, but they do affect a lot of our decision making down the road through a lot of different ways. So I'm going to talk about what can grape rootstocks actually do. So why do we use rootstocks? There's a whole bunch of reasons for this. One of the major reasons is for pest management. And I'm sure you're all familiar with phylloxera. Phylloxera decimated the European wine industry back in the late 1800s because it's an American pest that was taken over there. And Vitis vinifera, or the wine grape, is absolutely not resistant to it in the least. So that's one of the big reasons we use rootstocks for Vitis vinifera specifically. Nematodes are another soil pest that we can manage using rootstocks. We also use rootstocks for vigor management, right? So we want to increase it in some cases or decrease it in others, and rootstocks can help with that. And also to, I would say deal with, but also best use the soil characteristics of the site we're looking at. So there's a lot of ways we can use rootstocks to optimize our viticulture production. When we talk about rootstocks, we're talking usually about a cross or sometimes just a single species of different parent vines. So a lot of these crosses were made from the American species. Like I said, especially for phylloxera, the American grape species do have some natural resistance to phylloxera. So these were used when making those crosses for dealing with this pest. So we'll talk about a couple of these different grape species. The first one on the left there is Vitis berlandieri. So this is a really vigorous native vine. It's got very deep roots. And it's very drought tolerant. And this is because it's native to Southern North America. So like New Mexico, Texas, Arkansas. So if you imagine, these areas can be really dry, and they often have very calcareous soils. So high pH, maybe difficult to obtain water. So these vines thrive in these more drier sites. Vitis rupestris, the next one over, this is a pretty vigorous grape in general. These have a long vegetative cycle, which may be useful where they're from, because they're from the southern and central US, where they might have a longer growing season. Up here, where it's colder, a longer vegetative cycle may not be optimal. However, if this has been crossed with a lot of these other Vitis species to get things that are maybe a little better for our Michigan. These also have pretty deep roots, which can contribute to A, the vigor that it has, and B, some of the drought resistance that it confers to its offspring. Vitis riparia is the third one, and that may look familiar to you. So Vitis riparia is the riverbank grape. This is our wild grape. When we say wild grapes in Michigan, especially for things like the grape berry moth model, we're really talking about Vitis riparia. We also have Vitis estivalis, which is the summer grape, which I'm not showing here, but that's also a wild grape found in Michigan. So these have, generally speaking, low vegetative vigor, and they don't do well in drought. And that's all because these are, they're called the riverbank grape. These are found in really wet areas in Michigan, obviously. So the shallow rooting helps them from essentially drowning in a lot of water, as well as take up a lot of water. So these are native to central and eastern Canada, as well as the central and northeastern US. Vitis champini. So this is a really vigorous, drought tolerant, lime tolerant, salt tolerant, has very deep roots. So this is actually a natural cross between a couple of Vitis mustingensis and I think Vitis rupestris. So there's a cross that occurred in nature to make this particular species. That's why it's got the X in it. And so this one confers a lot of nematode resistance as well. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But since it's native to Texas, again, it's got that drought tolerant and that lime tolerance that you see. So you can kind of see in the background of this picture the kind of environment that this would thrive in. So all of these were used as parents for crossing to develop the rootstocks that we use in viticulture. So like I mentioned, one of the reasons we use rootstocks, and probably the primary one we use rootstocks, is for phylloxera. And Rufus yesterday showed a picture of the foliar form of phylloxera on American grape species. They show up on the leaves oftentimes. So phylloxera feeding on the roots can cause gall formation, which disrupts the vasculature, makes it difficult for the plant to take up water, take up nutrients, and essentially can kill the plant in extreme situations. And so the galls are formed by the chemical secretions of these little, they're sucking louses, more or less. The foliar galls, which we may be familiar with, can disrupt photosynthesis, so they are problematic, though maybe less detrimental overall than the root galls that are caused by the root form of this. So the root form is especially dangerous, like I mentioned, on the Vitis vinifera species, on Vitis vinifera roots. The American species, they aren't impacted quite as hard as the Vitis vinifera because they're native to this area. They essentially grew up with phylloxera, so they know how to deal with it, in a manner of speaking. So and when you get these root galls and you end up with the death of the root, or places for the invasion of secondary fungi, you can end up with root rots, and that really does contribute to the overall decline and death of a vineyard ultimately. So for phylloxera, we have a lot. This is probably our very best weapon against phylloxera, are using these resistant rootstocks. It's something we use a lot of. Vitis riparian and Vitis rupestris are both parents that do have that resistance. Vitis champini, which is from Texas, as I mentioned, does have a lower resistance to this. So rootstocks that have that parentage may not be quite as resistant for phylloxera. And here's a picture. This is from Washington State. It's from Michelle Moyer out in Washington State, which recently had a phylloxera outbreak. So you can, and they're mostly on own roots, own-rooted vinifera. So you can see here the kind of damage phylloxera does when we have vines on their own roots. Nematodes are another soil pest that we can manage using rootstocks. So some rootstocks are resistant to certain, but definitely not all nematodes. The root knot nematode, Molidogine, that's the general group of them. So these guys here, in blue, this is the northern root knot. That's the root knot we have in Michigan. They invade the roots, and when they're there, they cause galls, and that reduces water movement. So Vitis vinifera is very susceptible to northern root knot nematode, as well as the other root knot nematodes. Dagger nematode, who's this large individual right here, genus Stiphanema. So these do cause direct damage to the roots, but they are most concerning because they act as a virus vector for what are called nepoviruses, which are nematode-transmitted viruses. So Stiphanema americanum, which is the species we have in Michigan, can transmit peach rosette mosaic virus, tobacco ring spot virus, and tomato ring spot virus, all of which we have in Michigan vineyards, so it is something to be aware of. The other species that is concerning in grapes in general is Ziphinema index, which transmits grapevine family virus, but we don't have Ziphinema index in Michigan. So, and Ziphinema, and the Ziphinema americanum can't transmit grapevine family virus. They're very specific to virus to species. They have a very tight relationship. So the one we have doesn't transmit grapevine family virus, which is good to know. So let's look at some of this table of some common rootstocks. You'll see this table a couple times for different qualities that we're looking at. So this one specifically is for nematode resistance. So you can see here we have some direct accessions. So Riparia gloire, for example, is a Vitis riparia. St. George is a Vitis rupestris. Those are just straight accessions. The reason we can do that with those two species is Vitis riparia and rupestris both graft pretty well, so they're easier to graft. Some of these other Vitis species don't graft particularly well with Vitis vinifera, so we really have to cross them to get that grafting compatibility up. So these don't have much. So I'm showing, this is data for the southern root knot nematode and for Ziphinema index, the dagger nematode that we don't have, and that's because a lot of the research done on nematodes resistance is on species that are common in California. So these aren't the exact species that we have in Michigan. However, I mean, this is a good example of what it would likely look like And I'll show you some things that are a little more relevant to the species we do have in a second. So Vitis champini, like I mentioned, is a natural cross. This is really where a lot of our root knot nematode resistance comes from. So if that is a concern, something with Vitis champini is usually a good use for that. So it's got medium to high resistance to southern root knot nematode, and also resistance to some other root knot nematodes. So this is things like Ramsey, Dogridge, Freedom, Harmony, and some of the newer things like Kingfisher and the GRN series. These, like I mentioned earlier, champini does not necessarily have the best phylloxera resistance. So unless you are really concerned about root knot nematodes, you found a bunch, I wouldn't pick these necessarily for Michigan, just given that we do have phylloxera. The Berlandieri by Riparian also have medium to high. This, not sure exactly why, but that's the case. So both Vitis Berlandieris can have any range of these, but the Riparia and Rupestris generally don't have any resistance to root knot nematodes. All of these, it says low to medium. I wouldn't really give any of these probably a lot of credit as far as being resistant to dagger nematode. Low to medium, but if they're moving viruses around, is medium enough? I don't think so. So I'm going to show you these. So this graph is actually from Washington State. Some work I did out there with Michelle Moyer, looking at rootstocks for these two nematode species that we find both in Washington and in Michigan. As we look at this, so this is for dagger nematode, the Xiphinum americanum. And so these are 4 different, here, let me go back to the first slide. So the ones I've highlighted here, so Harmony, Teleki 5C, 1103 Paulson, 10114, all sorts of different crosses are ones that we looked at out in Washington State. You can see here, and then we have the 2 own-rooted. One is grafted and not grafted. It's just to see if there's any sort of effect of the grafting itself on some of these responses. And you can see there's really no difference in any of these sampling periods, fall 2014, spring 2015. These are the numbers of nematodes in the soil. Between dagger nematodes. So really none of these have any real, what I would consider a real resistance to dagger nematode, the species that we do have. So if you're concerned with Xiphinum americanum, if you're concerned with the Nepo viruses, rootstocks are not going to be able to deal with that. So that you might have to take other measures. For the root knot nematodes, so this again is also in Washington State. So this is the northern root knot nematode, similar to the nematode we have here in Michigan. The same varieties, the same rootstocks. You can see this is before a fumigation event, so they're all pretty even, but later, this is not fumigated. My apologies, this is before we didn't fumigate. So you can see here that the own-rooted stuff, the own-rooted on vinifera has way more nematodes than the 4 different rootstocks that we did test. One of which is Harmony, which does have that Vitis champini heritage. And that persists pretty well on. Eventually, they do start to develop some level of nematodes, but generally speaking, all of these confer some resistance to northern root knot nematode. So that's these are just something to think about when you start thinking about what kind of pest resistance you're looking for. The other thing you want to be doing, not only thinking about pests, is you really want to match your rootstock to the site you're in. So rootstocks can really help manage vineyard vigor, which is something that we struggle with in Michigan, just given the amount of water that we have, the amount of nutrients that we have. It's a very vigorous region, generally speaking. And so that can make it really difficult sometimes to manage some of our above ground canopy formation and to really get the kind of berry quality we're looking for when we're growing wine grapes. So some of the things Paolo talked about, I think on Tuesday, were things like hedging, breaking off leaves, other things, and those are all to manage vineyard vigor. So what we can also use a rootstock to try to change our vigor from the get-go, so that some of those other cultural management practices we do during the year maybe are a little bit easier, or we're just trying to match it with the natural vigor of the site. So in a high vigor site, for example, something with lots of water, lots of nutrition, a more silty, more clay, things that hold on to those things, you're going to want to choose a lower vigor rootstock. Usually that means some Vitis riparia heritage. Michigan has Vitis riparia, so it does very well in Michigan. You're gonna wanna avoid drought tolerant rootstocks in an area with a lot of water. A drought tolerant rootstock can really overgrow itself. And then end up being very large canopies. Then you have to try to knock down over the course of the year, over the course of the life of that vineyard. So these can really help with berry quality. So rootstocks generally speaking, don't really affect the berry quality directly. It's more of a secondary thing because they are affecting the vigor of the canopy. So an overly vigorous canopy, right? You end up with a lot of shading to the berry, so the berry's not getting enough sunlight to develop the kind of color it might need. Overly shaded canopies also mean you might have more foliar pests because the inside of the canopy is a better environment. It's wetter, so you might have a more problem with diseases. You may have to hedge more often, which means you're running a machine through more often. And so any number of these kind of secondary influences on the berry quality. So in lower vigor sites, you might want to choose something that's got a little bit higher vigor, so like medium to a higher vigor rootstock. I would say in general, Michigan is generally a high vigor in comparison to something like California, or Texas, where some of these grapes are from those regions, where it is more or less a desert, and they can put on the amount of water they want because it's irrigated. So a higher vigor rootstock might work better. Some are very dry, some are with very low nutrition, and areas that are prone to drought. A good indicator of this might be is if you've had a planting previously, or if you have nearby plantings and they're struggling in some way and with vigor, and you can't attribute it to something like other pests, trunk disease, crown gall, something else. It may be in your best interest, if you're going to plant again or plant nearby, to pick a different rootstock, or at least look at the rootstocks you've already planted and use that as kind of a baseline for where you want to go. So speaking of vigor, same varieties here. So Vitis riparia, as I mentioned, generally speaking, has low vigor, and these are all relative to each other. It's going to change depending on your scion as well. It's a complicated process, so I can only give you general guidelines, really. But it's something to think about. Vitis rupestris has, generally speaking, high vigor. The Champinis, high vigor. Berlandieri and riparia are low to medium. With this rupestris, again, we're seeing high vigor again. So anything really that has this Vitis riparia heritage, more or less, is probably going to have lower vigor. So these are things like Riparia gloire, which I know we use a lot. Hope you can hear that airplane. 1103 Paulson, in some places 10114 I've seen a lot of. So these might be good options. SO4 we do use because it does have, we use it a lot in northern climates. It's pretty cold hardy, generally speaking. So the flip side of that also is drought tolerance. So Vitis riparia, the riverbank grape, is going to have really low drought tolerance because it's used to having a lot of water. The grapes that are from the southern regions and areas where drought would be more normal, like Vitis Champini, Vitis Berlandieri, these are probably going to have better drought tolerance. It's not something that I think, well, this year, we may have to deal with quite a lot, but it is something to consider, especially if you're on a site that's prone to drought, very sandy sites, for example, without any irrigation. And some of the reasons behind this, let's look at this chart really quickly. So Vitis riparia, like I said, has very shallow roots. And so this is from a study in 1905, but it shows kind of the rooting patterns of these different crosses. So riparia and Berlandieri, riparia and rupestris. But then if you have Berlandieri and rupestris, both which are deep rooted, you're going to have much deeper roots. So they're going to be able to access water from deeper down in the soil. They're going to be able to tolerate drought longer because they're reaching deeper into the soil. So the root architecture of these things is part of what's conferring some of these tolerance levels, which I think is really, really interesting, very cool. Another aspect of the soil in general is by nutrition. Different rootstocks might take up different nutrients better or more poorly, and most of our nutrition is coming through the soil solution. So that just makes sense, given that it's roots that take these up. So just as an example, Maleg 4453, which is not one I've seen used extensively, takes up potassium better than it takes up magnesium. And in cases where you have very potassium-rich soils, you may see deficiencies in magnesium in the above-ground scion, just because it's preferentially taking up potassium rather than magnesium. On the flip side of that, 1103 Paulson, for example, has a really high affinity for magnesium. So in a magnesium-poor soil, it may do better at taking up that nutrient. So that's just an example of one of the ways that rootstocks can be used to take advantage of the natural site characteristics. In response to soil pH, so rootstocks with Vitis berlandieri or Vitis champini heritage usually can withstand higher pH and calcareous soils, which generally speaking go hand in hand, and they are because they're from those areas. We do have, so Vitis riparia is probably going to be better in a lower soil pH, so more acidic soils. Let's talk about cold hardiness, because the cold hardiness is always a question in Michigan. Generally speaking, most of these rootstock varieties are very cold hardy. And really a grafted vine is as cold hardy as its least hardy part, which is usually for us the Vitis vinifera scion. There are rootstocks that are less cold hardy, so some of those that are coming from, that are parented from those southern regions may be less cold hardy, so to speak, than the Riparia rupestris, but it's probably still going to be more hardy than the Vitis vinifera scion. And we think about the graft union isn't going to be any less cold hardy than either of these parts, unless it's compromised. So something like crown gall would be something that would compromise the graft union. If the union hasn't healed, if it did a poor job of healing, or if it hasn't had an opportunity to heal. So if you're planting grafted vines late in the season, you may be setting yourself up for some cold damage at that point. The risk of cold damage stays the same, really, but what do you do to prepare for cold damage and how do you respond is different than if you had, say, own-rooted vines. So you can regraft them. We're all very familiar with rootstocks in Michigan, so I think we're all familiar with that. Covering up the graft union in the winter is a good way to ensure the cold hardiness of that graft union, which is, it's a spot that can be compromised. And then when we use multiple trunks, we can usually recover from any cold damage that we're having. So here's a table. This is one big table. It's from Lambert Anderson Wolpert from 2008. This is just to give you another look at, just all in one, some of these rootstocks, their parentage, respective vigor, drought, lime resistance, salt resistance, so they can also deal with salinity in the soil as well, which may be a concern to you. It's something definitely when you're starting a vineyard, you do want to get soil tests to know what you were dealing with, so you can pick an appropriate rootstock to go with your above ground preference. Whether or not can tolerate wet feet, I know we definitely have some spots that have clay lenses or clay in general. So some of these are going to be better adapted to clay. For example, like 5C is better adapted to clay than, say, let's look Freedom, for example, which or maybe St. George, which is a Vitis rupestris. So a table like this might be helpful, especially when you're trying to choose a rootstock for your site, but knowing your site's going to be your number one issue in picking a rootstock. And the last thing I really want to talk about, I didn't have a video, unfortunately, but I am going to talk about some research we have at SwimRec. If you've been to our field day in person in the past, you may be familiar with what we call the Vineyard of the Future. And this is actually, we're not talking about Vitis vinifera right now. We're switching gears and we're talking about juice grapes. So these will be Vitis labrusca. These are Concord grapes, established in 2011 at SwimRec. And you might ask, why would you ever put a Concord grape on a rootstock? Those are American grapes. They're not concerned with any of these pests, these soil pests we've been talking about. And the idea here is so we've had some on a rootstock, so SO4, and on its own roots. And then we've tried two different training systems. So one is a 2-tier system, which is 7 foot tall, or the top wire standard, which is about 6 feet tall. And the idea here is, how do we get a higher yield from the same amount of acreage? Because we know in juice grape production, it's really about how do I get the best yield, still getting the right amount of sugars while not overstressing the vine. So that's really the idea of this vineyard, is how do we make a Concord planting yield more be more efficient in a way. So for this experiment, we've been collecting this data since, it started in 2011, we've been collecting data since 2014. This was started by Tom Zabadal, sorry, my predecessor, so I inherited this project. But it's a good project. So we're measuring yield, we measure bricks, we measure pruning weights, and a couple other things, but those are really the top three that we're concerned with as far as would the system work commercially? So if we look at these pictures here, this is what the 6-foot top wire looks like. So it looks like a standard juice grape planting, right? And then we have here a picture from the winter time. So hopefully you can see what's actually going on is the 7-foot 2-tier system. So we have up here at 7 feet, we have the top wire, but then also down here about 4 feet, we have a second cordon, so that we're harvesting fruit from up here and down here. So we're trying to get as much light as possible and develop as much fruit as possible on the same amount of acreage. So all of this whole vineyard is mechanically pruned, shoot combed, mechanically harvested as well. So these grapes are harvested commercially from our plot. Though we do hand pruning and hand harvesting for all of the research data, which, as you can imagine, on 7-foot trellis requires a ladder. But this is what that looks like at harvest. So you have this whole wall of shoots here, up to 7 feet. So it's pretty tall, but it is harvestable with a commercial harvester. So it would work in a mechanical situation. So really the first question was, can we increase yield on the same amount of area? So when we look at this graph, so this is a graph of tons per acre from 2014 to 2019. So the blue one is the own-rooted top wire, which is the industry standard. And then we also had the rootstock SO4, which is a Vitis berlandieri riparia cross to the top wire. So it would be a rootstock up at the normal height, let's say. And then the gray bar is own-rooted, but up at a 2-tier. So what if we just elevate the canopy up a foot and put in another cordon? And then the last one is the whole shebang, where we put in a rootstock and we also put it up on this 2-tier training system. And if you look at each of these years, the trend is pretty clear overall, right? So the standard, the own-rooted top wire has the least yield every year. The most yield every year is coming from this rootstock, which is conferring more vigor, and then a 2-tier, which is taking advantage of that vigor. In between are the other two scenarios. So if these letters, what the letters mean is if the letters are the same within a year, that means that they're not statistically different. So really what we can say is there's a trend towards, if you have a rootstock only, or if you go up to a 2-tier only, that there may be more yield, but it's not necessarily different from the own-rooted. But in every case, we can say that this SO4 2-tier has the highest yield. And overall, across all of these years, it's about 29% higher than the own-rooted top wire, which is the standard on average. If we look just at 2019, over here, you can see that we have the standard is about 8 tons per acre, at least at our site. And then the rootstock plus this 2-tier, the extra tall, is about 12 tons per acre. So that's a difference in 4 tons. Like, that's a pretty significant difference in yield off the exact same amount of area. So really we're trying to match this rootstock to the training system to take advantage of as much of the vigor as possible. So this is a little different of an idea than we would for vinifera vineyard, where we're really trying to get all of those quality characteristics we're after. But here we are still looking for quality characteristics, right? We still need to hit the amount of sugar we need. So we still need to hit bricks. So is the sugar high enough in these sites now that we've upped some of these the yield parameters? And if you look at this, there are no letters here, which means there's no difference in bricks happening here. Colors are all the same, years are all the same. So we're not seeing any difference between any of these in bricks. Now we see a difference between years, and that makes sense. Every year is different, right? Every vintage is different. And you may notice that sometimes we're below this purple line. That's the cutoff for the commercial acceptance. So we do harvest our stuff, the data vines, before the commercial harvester comes through. That, I mean, obviously we don't want to lose our data. So on average, it's about 1 brick lower from from what we actually see when they do go into the plant. However, each year, even when they're low, when we do the data collection, each year we have, all of these have met the Brix cutoff for national, which means that any of these systems would work as far as getting the sugars up to the point we need, at least again, at our site. So it's always something to think about, is at your site. And then the third thing I'm thinking about is, how is the vine growth impacted, right? So you may have a lot of fruiting vigor and you may have the sugars up, but you don't want to impact the vine to a detrimental point, right? Like you don't want to reduce your vine growth so that you end up with diminishing vine health and diminishing yields eventually. So we're looking at, we don't have the 2020 data on here, but we do have all these other years. And similarly to the Brix, we don't really see a difference in pruning weight within the year, right? So it looks like even when we're getting this really upped yield and these upped sugars, we're not overcropping the vines at all. We haven't seen a diminishment in some of these really, the SO4 two-tier in comparison to the own-rooted top wire. So the takeaway from that is really that you can increase yield on the same area and ripen fruit properly by using a rootstock and training combination for Concord grapes. This is mechanizable. You do need to shoot position, especially with that lower cordon. If you don't shoot position, they're not going to get the amount of light they really need. Anecdotally, when we were harvesting last year, we noticed we had fairly low yields on the lower cordon. They were important to that overall yield that we got out, but they were relatively low, and we hadn't done all the shoot positioning that year. So I think that probably contributed to our low yields on that lower cordon. So you do need to make sure you do that with this system. You want to get as much light in as you can. And I don't think anybody is hand harvesting Concord, but you do need a ladder. They're really too tall to hand harvest in any effective way. So the initial cost would be increased because grafting vines are always more expensive, but maybe taller posts might be more expensive, but later, generally speaking, your costs are going to be about the same, especially if you're mechanized. So it's, I don't know who's putting in Concord vineyards, but if you are thinking about it, this may be a way to up your yields on the same amount of acreage that you would plant normally. So something to think about. We're still doing, work is ongoing actually at the station. So you'll probably hear more about it later. So in generally what rootstocks can do, they confer pest and disease resistance or tolerance that lets us use less chemicals or no chemicals in some cases. We have advantages and disadvantages with water and drought. We can use the genetics of these things to get, to really tailor to the site, like soil pH, salinity, nutrient management, and pick something with a rooting pattern that really matches the soil depth, or if you have any soil restrictions. In addition, really that vigor management is really important. That's one of the, other than I would say phylloxera, probably the thing you're most concerned about when we're picking a rootstock is, I don't want to make it harder for myself down the line. How do I make it easier for myself? And just keep in mind, there's still a lot we don't know. So these specific rootstock scion interactions, depending on what your rootstock is and what your scion is, and the site you're at, we may not know entirely what's going to happen. But these are just some general guidelines when you start approaching it. So when you make these planting choices, just remember that your scion does not necessarily permanent, but your rootstock's probably going to be. So you want to make sure you're choosing a rootstock that does fit your site. And I totally understand you may be limited by what the supplier has. But regardless, just keep in mind those aspects, because you may want to make a decision that's maybe different depending on what you have. So a lot of these rootstocks are going to have that phylloxera resistance. They are going to be low or medium vigor. So you do have some leeway. There isn't one perfect rootstock, but there are better choices, right? So make sure it's not an afterthought when you do choose your rootstock. And with that, I will take any questions. Let's see if I have any.
You do have a couple. Looks like one person here mentions that they have Marquette, which is a hybrid that is own-rooted and is incredibly vigorous. They even joke around saying their laterals have laterals. So it takes multiple hours to thin their small vineyard. So basically, they're concerned they might have the wrong rootstock. So want a little more input on if own-rooted vines are a good fit for particular sites for situations like hybrids, and if it's possible to get vines that are typically own-rooted, is it possible to get some of them on rootstocks?
Okay, that's a really good question. So I didn't mention hybrid vines at all. So they can be on their own roots. They do have resistance to a lot of things, but you can also get them on rootstocks. So if currently it sounds like your own rooted vines are really overly vigorous on your site. So it may be a good option, especially, I mean, you're gonna have to deal with it, right? That's how it is with some of these cultural things. But if you were going to plant more or plant later, I'd consider maybe looking at some of these, whatever we call low vigor rootstocks. I don't know much on Marquette. I'm trying to think. I will look and see if I know, if we have any literature on Marquette specifically as a scion. Usually if you contact the suppliers, so AA, somebody like them, Inland Desert, other places, they should be able to do that for you if you make clear, like, hey, I would like this on this. Like, for example, we have Concord on SO4. Like, that's not anything anyone really ever asks for. So you should be able to contact them and ask them for that, and they'll let you know if it's possible or not. It may cost extra, and you're probably going to want to do that earlier than you normally would, so they have time to actually make those grafts, heal them up, and then get them to you. So yeah, that's what I'd say for that one.
Okay, we do have another more of a comment than a question, talking about, you were talking about rootstocks and their influence on mineral uptakes. They wanted to just make sure that we were taking into account the fact that some minerals such as magnesium and potassium are antagonists. And so if you have high levels of one, it'll impact the absorption of the other. And so how would rootstocks have an impact in that situation?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So they are antagonists in the soil. So if you think about it, if you have high levels of potassium, it's going to affect the absorption of magnesium. And then if you also have a rootstock that doesn't absorb magnesium very well, then you've just got a perfect storm of how you're not going to be able to absorb much magnesium just at all. It may be, and in the case that you do have some of these, the vice versa is true, right? So you may be able to alleviate some of that, definitely not all of it, because that is just, that's an aspect of the soil and the chemistry in it. But some of, like, for example, 1103 Paulson may be able to mitigate a little of that. But yeah, that's definitely a good point. It's something to keep in mind.
We're open to some more questions. I did want to bring up a couple of them that have been, we wrote some answers in already. For anyone interested in getting getting access to the recordings for this week, including today, you can reach out to any of the presenters or hosts from this week, and we can get you to where you need to go to get access to these videos once they are available online. It'll probably be a couple weeks before we can get them online and available for viewing. But reach out to us and we can help you out on that. Any other questions? Looks like you answered them all.
All right.
Oh, here we go.
Good one.
Some have seen articles where rootstocks 3 feet high with grafts just below the bottom cordon. Has this been a successful method?
Yeah, there's no real reason why that would be a problem, except for when we start thinking about something like cold damage, right? So we really want to make sure that, especially we're in Michigan, we want to cover that graft union if we can. And if it's 3 feet high, that might be really difficult to do. Otherwise, yeah, not really an issue with that. That would be my big concern with where that graft is, as well as if you are trying to train up things from lower, if it's below the graft union, it's going to be the rootstock, and you definitely don't want that fruit.
Cool. Well, no more questions are coming in. So I did want to say thank you to all those that have attended today and the weekend as a whole. And just wanted to plug it one more time. There will be a survey that'll pop up as soon as the presentation is finished, the webinar is finished. If you have not filled out the survey this week so far, please do so. It'll help us out immensely.